Well, what an honor to be with you guys today, and what a fun introduction from the councilwoman. I appreciate that. My name is Elizabeth Garner. I'm the state demographer for Colorado, and you may kind of wonder, why am I here? And I appreciate the direction that the symposium is going and the context behind it. And I think it's also really important to understand what are some of the trends that are going to be impacting the state as we move forward. And I'm going to see if, it's almost there. All right, perfect. No worries.
The only time we do a technology
you're good.
switch here, so sorry about that.
As we move forward, what are some of these trends, kind of like who are we, that are going to be affecting kind of the strategies that you need to be looking at as we move forward, as well as some of the concepts behind equity as well. So one of the pieces that you might be thinking about, and I'd want you to think about it, especially in the context of, most of our speakers already this afternoon, is really looking at this kind of environmental consequence of people. And I'm just going to make sure it moves. Yep, it does. You're awesome. Thank you. And so many times people are like, Elizabeth, I'm done with people. And I'm like, I'm the demographer. That's all we do. And I ask, what is it about people? And it is kind of this concept, they're on our streets, they're in our houses, they're on our ski slopes. I'm like, yeah, no, I get that. But what do you think about jobs? And I'm sorry, I'm just setting my timer so that I'm cognizant. And they're like, jobs are awesome. Jobs are the best. We want more. I'm like, okay, but a job is a person. And a housing unit is where that job sleeps at night. So how can we be anti-people yet pro-job growth? So as I talk today, I want you to be thinking about that, because you may come to the conclusion or the lens that all I'm saying is that growth is good. What I'm hoping to present is what we're seeing and what are the implications. And definitely the implications, as far as what I'll get to right now, is the fact that we're starting to see a slowing in the population, which a lot of people might cheer about. But have we built our systems to accommodate the slowdown? And so definitely I love those videos. That was great. But looking at how we invest in infrastructure, if we don't have money to invest in infrastructure, and the way we get money is by people paying taxes, and yet we're seeing a slowdown in population growth, So these are some things to be thinking about and strategies as we start to look forward. So yes, we are starting to see population starting to slow. Primarily because we're seeing births slow and we're seeing deaths increase. Deaths increase not only because of COVID, but also because we're getting older. We're seeing concentrated growth in metro areas, and that has implications in terms of equity. You heard Troy mention that dealing with Lincoln County and also South Central Colorado. Aging. Who woke up a day older? All right, so that is another big trend, and I can tell you we have been looking for that fountain of youth forever, and not no matter what, but God willing, tomorrow I will be a day older, and that doesn't change, and so we are going to see these implications of aging. Migration and mobility are slowing. I know you may not believe that if you live in the Denver metro area, but we are seeing this slowdown. We're also seeing the fact that we are becoming more racially and ethnically diverse. And that has been the fastest growth in our population. So I'll talk a little bit about that. So therefore, because of some of these other trends that we're seeing in the state, we're seeing that the labor force is super tight, and people are looking at policy about that tight labor force, and I want people to be thinking about what those policies could be. And we're also seeing, huge constraints in terms of housing and really looking at that balance between supply and demand. So big picture, I'm going to try and convince this of you And you may already believe me, which is great, then I don't have to spend as much time. But the US is slowing down. The last decade was our second slowest decade on record, second slowest to the Great Depression decade of the 30s. Last year, we had our slowest ever year growth. It's about 350,000 in the US as a whole, a 0.1. 17 states lost population. So if the US is slowing, that's going to put downward pressure on Colorado. For Colorado, we increased by 744,000 this last decade. It was about our third slowest decade on record. So it's right in the middle in terms of performance. 14% growth rate over the decade. We competed, we were somewhere in the top 10 in terms of states, depending if you're looking at percentage or absolute growth. But this last year, we had one of our slowest growing decades since the 1980s. We grew by 27,000 people, 0.5%. So we are really seeing this slowdown, and relative to other states. So this is important to recognize the fact that we are slowing, and what does that mean? If we look at the state and we look at the growth over the decade, red, orange, yellow, positive, all of the shades of blue decline. We had about 16 counties decline in population, aggregated to about 7,200 people, so not a ton. But you can see the darkest color, red, is where we had the fastest growth or the most growth along the I-25 corridor. And what we've seen is that basically bigger counties getting bigger, smaller counties getting smaller. 25% of Colorado's counties declined, but nationally, 50% of counties declined in the U.S. So interesting to see these transitions from kind of rural to urban. We've seen it over decades, but also to see it continuing. 95% of Colorado's total growth this last decade was in metro areas. I like to put this up there because I want then us in the urban areas to appreciate the rural areas. This has every single county along the horizontal axis and the growth over the last decade. And you can see it's 10 counties. Right? And so for us in the urban areas, we need to appreciate the fact that a lot of our state bounces around zero in terms of that growth. So sometimes it's good to see it, to feel it. If we look at total population change over the decade, there's two components that really lead to change. One is called natural increase, which is represented by the blue. That's births minus deaths. The red component is net migration, the ins minus the outs. And I put this up here for a reality check because there's an entity that needs to be at these conversations as well. It's called the media. We need to work on conversations. I'm an economist. Okay, we are not notoriously known as good communicators, right? We're right there with like accountants. Nothing against accountants. But it's important to recognize, if you look at this data and you look at the right-hand side, you can see the slowdown in the population growth, especially since 2015. But we're nowhere close to the growth that we saw in the 1990s. But what do you hear in the media all the time? Exponential growth, people flocking to the state. And I'm like, what are you looking at? If you remember any math class, there is no exponential component on this chart, right? So if the media isn't telling the story, are we missing the point? And I think this really ties in a lot with the work that you're going to be doing. If we're not exponentially growing and we still feel uncomfortable, why? What is it that might else be failing? Is it something related to infrastructure? Is it other policy choices? Are we just picking on the easiest variable to pick on? Oh, there's too many people. Well, maybe we just didn't plan well. And I'm sorry, I know a lot of you are planners. But it's communicating it, right, to other people. But you did see that slowdown on that far right-hand side, which is what I'm going to talk about in a second, slowdown in growth. Part of the reason we're seeing this slowdown is this slowdown in the under 18 population, slowdown in births. Colorado's down about 8,000 fewer births per year now than we had in 2007, which was our peak year. The United States is down about 525,000 fewer births per year than their peak in 2007. The U.S. as a whole lost 1 million people under the age of 18 over the last decade. We are down 1 million. So you should be thinking through your head, ooh, fewer kiddos, then that means fewer K-12, then that means fewer going into higher ed. Oh, that means fewer going into the labor force. So hopefully that all happened. 27 of the 50 states lost population under the age of 18. If we now look at Colorado, Colorado grew its population under the age of 18 by 38,000 people. 5% of our total growth was in our under 18. If we look at a map of the state, red, orange, yellow, positive, all of the shades of blue decline. 43 of the 64 counties had an absolute decline in the under 18 population. Is this impact now? Yes. Does it impact us differently? Absolutely. But there is no region in the state that did not experience an absolute decline in that under 18 population. So when we think about who are our future leaders, who are our next labor force, we really need to be strategically thinking about how do we make sure those kiddos are even better than before, right? Because there's going to be fewer of them to help out. So they need to be even better than before. The other piece is then net migration. When we migrate people to Colorado, we migrate young adults. That's an age distribution. Ages along the horizontal axis. Our key folks are 22 to 37. What did I say is going to be slowing down? Our youngins. So we had an absolute decline in the U.S. of the under 18. Oh, well, this next decade, we should really anticipate pretty big slowdown for the under 28. Is that part of our bread and butter that Colorado's always depended on? Absolutely. Are we at risk more than many states? Absolutely. Because we've never had to fight for our young adults. We've always kind of had them. They've always kind of come here. What happens if that changes? And I think that's a risk we need to look at. As I mentioned before, people aren't the bad person necessarily. I don't know how to say that. We're not that bad. We need to be thinking, though, that this relationship between jobs and population, that when we see job growth, which are the blue bars, that's when we tend to see net migration. And there is that correlation, and any strategy policy that we look at in the future has to look at that. We can't just, and I'm sorry, I don't want to pick on any local government in particular, but if we just ban housing, does that fix it? Okay, strategies, smart strategies. So let's talk about that housing issue. Well, one of the things that we didn't do this last decade was build housing. And again, people are blaming people, not housing, on the problem. They're saying, oh, there are just too many people moved here. And I'm like, actually, fewer people moved here than I forecasted. So we could have been even worse. But the Great Recession did a doozy, right? It knocked industries out. And it's been really hard to rebuild those construction industry in Colorado. So the red bars or the orange bars are the new housing coming online every year. The black line is household formation. So we can see really between the last decade and this decade, we really slowed down housing production. And in fact, we built 126,000 fewer housing units this decade than we did last decade. Yet our population increased by about the same amount. So, right? And this is easy math to figure out why we're faced with a lot of these challenges and the fact that we've got the fourth highest median fourth highest median home price, yet only the 12th highest household income. Makes it tough to live here. We can see, though, there are positives. This is looking at real median household income over time. Colorado is the red, U.S. is the blue, and we can see that over time, we're seeing improvements in real median household income. So that's awesome, and I want you to remember that point. We're also, unfortunately, seeing increases in real home prices. This is looking at the home price index, and it increased by 103% for Colorado compared to 57% for the U.S. Between 2010 and 2021. So are we doing worse than average? Yes. Not that you didn't know that. Switching gears real quick, age, you can't change it. You are what you are, and we're going to hopefully every year you get a little bit older. But it impacts everything that you do. All of your preferences, what kind of housing you can get into and stay in, how you participate in the labor force, how much money you make, what service demands you will need. If we look at Colorado's population by age and growth over the next decade, so the blue is 2020, the orange is 2030. We can see really flat growth for the under 18 population. Really that 18 to 24, very slight population growth forecast, again, as I already had mentioned. Hopefully, we'll see some growth, and I kind of showed my cards. I said, hopefully, we see growth in that 25 to 44. I am still of the vein that I think we're going to need workers. That's just where I am. And most of that growth is actually going to come from migration. We can see very little growth in the 45 to 64, but then if you look at the 65 plus, in absolute terms, forecast to increase the most of all age groups. So over the decade, we're forecast to increase by a little over 700,000. The 65 plus are forecast to be about 43% of that. Now, typically, people are working longer because they want to or have to. But typically with that 65 plus, most of them aren't in the labor force. I'm going to tell you, I'm going to also show you my cards. I'm hoping that I retire over this decade. That gives you a sense generally of how old I am. Am I leaving? No, my family's here. Am I going to move out of my house? Nah. Next state demographer, she's not living there. There's 1 million of me out there. Forecast to age out of the labor force between last decade and this decade. Where are they all new workers going to live if I'm aging in place? I'm staying here. And we're not seeing a lot of us leave to Florida. God forbid. Sorry, I shouldn't have said that so loud. Texas, Arizona. We're not leaving like we used to. And so that's important to be thinking about, that a lot of our growth is going to be growth in older adults that aren't in the labor force. Yep. Our age is different by location in the state. If we look at the red, orange, yellow, those are areas that are red, orange, peach, forecast to increase in the working age population. All of the shades of blue forecast a decline in the working age population. So thinking about equity, how are some parts of the state going to survive versus others? Last thing I'm going to talk about is the fact that we are becoming more racially and ethnically diverse. We can look at the two different charts. The top chart is looking at our 18 plus, and looking at our growth over the decade from 2010 to 2020, we can see kind of that lighter blue is our white non-Hispanic population, increased by about 40%. Of that total, was about 40% of that total growth. That means 60% was our people of color. So our largest growth and our fastest growth rate, people of color. If you look at our under 18 population, absolute decline in our under 18 population, white non-Hispanic. Our only growth in our under 18 population was our people of color. Is this critical that we think about equity and diversity and inclusion as we move forward? Absolutely. It is the future of our state. Our youngest adults are much more diverse. That's what this shows. Higher share of our young folks are more people of color than our older population. These are the folks that are also entering the labor force. We're seeing improvements across the board. This is looking at educational attainment. We're seeing it across the board for all race ethnic groups. But there is still, if you poke at the very last end, there is still a huge disparity in educational attainment by race and ethnicity. There was a great segment done by a whole bunch of publications the last couple of weeks looking at graduation rates and attainment rates, and we can see improvements by race and ethnicity, but still gaps. So things to work on. So we're forecasting Colorado still to grow over the decades, increase still by 1.8 million, scary, people, but at a much slower rate than we've ever increased before. Red, orange, yellow, positive, all of the shades of blue, flat to declines. I'm not going to read the summary there, but basically you've heard all of this information. You've got to come up with strategies on how to thrive with the context of knowing what the population is driven by and who we are. So with that, thank you guys very much for having me today. I'm going to be here for most of the afternoon, so if you've got questions, we can hit those there. Thank you.